Well, we
Okay.
might get like a formal start on now, since it's 10 past 6, and anyone who comes late, that's on them, that's fine. But yeah, I mean, obviously we've got a bit of an echo chamber, a lot of people I already know in the chat, but just for introductory sake, so on video it looks like there's cool new people here. So where Youth Parliament is a program that's just sort of really catered towards providing young people in South Australia between the ages of 15 to 25 a more practical and like in leadership, like invigorating kind of experience at learning how the ins and outs of South Australian parliamentary system.
Which is not,
Um,
it's not natural, is it?
no, it's not. It's honestly, it's been an absolute wild ride, and I think many of the people here can agree that you end up pulling your hair out of your head most of the time with the amount of stress and the amount of negotiations and work that you're doing. But it's just a very wonderful opportunity for people to get a hands-on approach and take charge with reshaping how they think our democracy in South Australia is. Um, and obviously, I'll probably hand off to you, David, to give a little explanation on what ECSA's work is and what it is that you do and why it's so important, if that's okay.
Yeah, well, let's first start off. Um, the Electoral Commission, it's had many different names, but basically it's been in business since 1907, which is a fair whack at the stick, right? Um, we like to call ourselves the umpire. Now, if anybody watches sports, does the umpire always get the call right? If there's always that interpretation of, is the umpire biased to one side or the other side? So we have to be incredibly careful to ensure that we don't get called out for being biased. So everybody has to be treated equal. And as far as I know, we haven't been caught in the middle of taking sides. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't get accused of being biased, but in Parliament, you have the parliamentary privilege of getting to say things. So sometimes, if a ruling goes against you in Parliament, a parliamentarian can say, "Oh, we don't like that. You're, let's use the word corrupt, or you're this or that." Because of the parliamentary privilege, they can say that, but they never say that outside of Parliament because they'll get into trouble. So it's a little bit like it's a safe space where they can say, I don't like what you said, but outside of this space, we're not going to challenge it. Now, usually that only happens when the boundaries are redrawn. So the boundaries are your electoral district. When if it goes against somebody's current boundaries, where they say, well, wait a minute, is this good for me or not? And we're going to get into a little bit about how the boundaries are drawn, but that's a separate organization that does that, that's independent from us, the Electoral Commission, or as we like to call ourselves, ECSA. And the boundaries are done by this group called the EDBC, Electoral District Boundaries Commission. Whoa, it's exciting. Um, the EDBC, does anybody know about it? A little bit, maybe. Okay, so we know we have 47 electoral districts. So the Electoral Boundaries District Commission is in charge of making sure that each one of these electoral districts, they don't have to be the same size in geographical area, but they have to have around the same amount of people. Now, do you guys ever follow American politics? A little bit, when they're saying, like, do you ever heard the term gerrymandering, where a boundary is redrawn? So it's designed to help a politician win. So they can do these crazy shapes. Well, here, this organization, the EDBC, is designed so you can't have that. Each boundary at the moment has, or each electoral district theoretically should have 26,951 people. Now, if you go on our website, you will see statistics. Everybody loves statistics, but these statistics kind of show you that how each electoral district should be pretty close to that number. And when they redraw the boundaries, or when they look at the boundaries to see if they're fair or not, they have to take into account communities that resemble each other, distance, does your member actually represent you? So they just can't take a pencil and start cutting things up. So it's a pretty rigorous process. I can't say it's that exciting, but it is incredibly rigorous. And on this commission, the person in charge of it is they have a Latin word to what they're called, but it's the most senior Supreme Court judge. So that's the chair of this committee. And then the electoral commissioner sits there, and then there is the boundaries commissioner. So you got one person who's good at maps, one person who's good at dealing with the rules of elections, and one person who is the ultimate umpire. And so those three people make up this kind of super committee. And so sometimes you have to redraw boundaries. Like you ever see, what's a big community like in Paramano, pardon me, Paramano, where you see these new communities coming up, and suddenly they're looking like we have all these thousands and thousands of people moving in. Maybe we're going to have to redraw these boundaries so it reflects more. So they split things up. Sometimes they change names to try to honor famous South Australians and all the rest. But again, it's interesting to the point that it's boringly non-controversial. Okay, so that's a little bit about where we get our electoral districts, and they draw those boundaries up. And then on the day of the election, those boundaries they become legal, and that's who you're voting for. Now, I just made a couple little notes because there's a few things to talk about. Okay, so we don't take sides. Now, going back to ECSA, one of the rules is that everybody in South Australia has to vote. I have to vote. My colleagues have to vote. But in this office, we are told to shut our yaps about politics. We are nonpartisan. We don't pick a side. We can have our opinions, but to the public, on our social media, we do not pick a side. And that's something that it's pretty well. It's good business just to keep certain things to yourself. Now, I'm sure some of you followed a little bit of this election. Usually it's the pretty colors at the end of it to see who won. Currently, we are, pardon me. Okay, so the election day is the third Saturday in March every 4 years. Previously, it was on a Saturday so that everybody had a chance to vote. Now, with modern society, people's days, people's lives, things have changed a little bit. We have about a 90-something percentage enrollment rate. That doesn't mean everybody who's enrolled votes. For this election, because of COVID and different trends, we had a lot of early voting and postal voting. Now, if you're 18, you get to vote. Maybe your parents voted early, or maybe they voted by post. Now, if we go back to Donald Trump, remember how he's saying the election was stolen? A lot of that had to do with postal votes. Now, March 25th is the last day that a postal vote ballot can come back to us. So we are still counting these votes. Now, as we count these votes, the outcome of some of these seats can change. Now, Anthony Green, who's the election guru of Australia, has said that the Labor Party's already won. So there was a pretty big swing that the votes that did come in showed that the Labor Party had a majority. And to win a majority, or to win your seat, you need to win 50% of the vote plus one. So it's 50% plus one to win. Now, we had about 200, I'm looking at the statistics right now, over 200,000 early votes and 170,000 postal votes. Now, who was at Unley for 23 hours? Was that you, Claire?
My housemate.
Your housemate. So what they were counting was the ballots of that day. So they were only counting the ballots of that day. So that took that long to get those ballots counted. There's still another almost 300,000 ballots that had to be counted, or you could only start counting them on Monday by law. So some of these seats are pretty tight. Like I think Stephen Marshall's seat's a very tight seat that these ballots will change the outcome. It looked like he might have lost his seat. Now it looks like he's going to win his seat as these ballots come through. And then we had the fun of COVID voting. Because COVID is such a wild card for this election, ECSA was working with SAPOL, South Australian Police, and SAFECOM, the emergency service providers, to try to set up all of these different voting locations for people who had COVID. We had 10,000 people register and go through these special voting sites to drop off their ballots. Drop off their ballots or pick their ballots up? No, pick their ballots up. And so there was 10,000 sites across the state that people went into to vote. And this wasn't open to the general public. So part of this call center thing is we had a call center that we were registering Actually, that was going through online, registering these people and then trying to figure out how to get these ballots out there. So we had 22 sites across the state, and there was drivers from SafeCom, from our office, delivering ballots to these sites. Then we also had hundreds and hundreds of people who were too sick to even drive to their polling booths or be able to participate in the election. So we actually delivered to them specifically, which was a pretty massive job. That was one of the things I was doing, was trying to coordinate to say, okay, this person's too sick, they can't get there. How do we get the ballots to them? Now, not all countries go this far for this kind of to ensure that everybody has their voice. So you can say in South Australia, I think this is probably the first time in the history of Australia that they've delivered ballots like this. So this is, it's quite unique. Now, as we know, in Australia, voting is compulsory, and in most states, voting in your local government and state government elections are compulsory. In South Australia, local government isn't compulsory, but state is. So if you don't vote for your local government, you don't get a penalty. But if you don't vote for your state, you get a pretty big fine. Now, who wants to take a guess how many people didn't vote in the last election? Just a wild card, a wild guess.
I'm going to say 7,000 people.
7,000? Add another zero to that. And then raise it again by 10. 80,000 people didn't vote. Now, when you say that, that's a big number. Now, 80,000 people didn't vote doesn't mean that they were all anti-social people who want nothing to do with democracy and society. Some of them could have been overseas. Some of them could have been sick. We also, a valid excuse for not voting is religion, working, you're pregnant, you can't get to the polling booth. So pretty reasonable excuses, but you still get a pretty big group of, let's say, 40 to 50,000 people who say, you know what, stuff it, I don't care, I don't want to vote. And those are the people that we really try to work with to see, can we change their behavior? And some people just don't want to do it. And, you know, in a democracy, you actually have a right not to vote, but there's also a consequence to that. So you don't have to vote, but there's a consequence to that. And the consequence is a fine. Who wants to guess what the fine is? Okay. And then this is my favorite part. No, go for it.
Like $10 or something?
Yeah, see, that's a really good answer, because in the federal elections, it's like 10 or 20 bucks. And so usually what happens is, most times there's a federal election earlier than a state election. So people who don't vote say, it's only 20 bucks, it's only 10 bucks. For us, it's 80 bucks. That's what it starts at. So it starts at 80, then it starts doubling. And then they don't pay. This goes to another organization called the Fines Recovery Enforcement Unit. And they look at that and they say, I want the money. So they do things like they'll stop you from renewing your registration. You can't get a license. They'll just take money out of your bank account. And so some people don't learn. Though we're not out there to punish them, but at the same time, you got to pay your dues, right? And this is part of it. If you don't want to participate, well, pay the fine. And they get quite upset when they see the price of the fine. Now, what age is the age of enrollment for South Australia?
It's 18, yeah?
No,
enrollment 16, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay. I'm not going to jump the front and steal your answers. Yeah, so it starts at 16. Now, who thinks 16 would be a good age to vote? Who would want to vote at 16? I would have. When I grew up in Canada, getting your license, you can get your license at 16. So I thought, if you can drive a car, you're paying registration, you can kill somebody, you should be able to vote. But no, I think Canada is 18, just like Australia. So yeah, so that's called the provisional enrollment. So you can provisionally enroll at 16, but you can't vote until you are 18. And I think it was the Green Party and the ACT was really trying to petition to lower the voting age. And then there's pros and cons against it. Like, some people say they're too young. I've met some people who are in their 30s and 40s, and I say, you guys aren't even old enough to vote. Like, mentally, they're not old enough. But again, age is very subjective. You can, well, youth parliament's a pretty good example of watching some of the speeches that you guys come up with. I'm like, yeah, that's tight. And I've seen adults who couldn't hold themselves in a conversation. So yeah, so it's a pretty subjective marker. Where's my little list? Now, voting. When you vote, your ballot is secret. So that means we don't know if you voted, but we do try to say if you vote, we want it to be formal. What do you think the informality, how many people don't actually vote properly is? You can give me a percentage or a number, it doesn't matter.
Isn't it usually around about 5%?
Okay, we have 5%. Anybody else?
I was going to say 3%.
3% to 5%. Yeah, we'll split the difference. And I got the stats from 2018. It was 4.1% for both houses. So that's the House of Assembly and the Legislative Council, which is probably around, don't quote me on this one, but about 35,000 people. Now, some of this informality is people who are genuinely making mistakes, and some of it is for people who don't care. That could be drawing very creative pictures on ballot papers, which is legal. There's no law that says you're not allowed to draw, you're not allowed to express yourself. Now, the law says that you have to have your name marked off the electoral roll, but because it's a secret ballot, it's all up to you what you want to do with that paper. If you want to write us a haiku, you can do that. We do prefer if you vote because it makes things a little bit more interesting. And then what do you guys think now? The state election is over. What happens next? What do we do? Do we sit back and watch Netflix? What do you guys think we do?
Start preparing for the next election.
In a sense, yeah. Well, that's one of the big things is we start to review everything, but right after this election in November, in South Australia, is quite unique. You have state elections in March, and then you have local government elections in November. So we have already started preparing for the local government elections. And in between that, you are going to get a federal election. Now, we don't have anything really to do with the federal election. We do try to help them out if we can. That's run by the Australian Electoral Commission. But for us, the local government elections, in a sense, could even be bigger than the state elections because, I think for the state elections, we have something like 400 candidates. So 400 people are, I think, running. In the local government elections, you have thousands of candidates. So the barrier of entry is a lot lower. The stakes are lower, but at the same time, it's way bigger in that sense. And it's fully postal voting. So who is our environmental lawyer? Who wants to be the environmental lawyer? Is it Olivia?
That's me, yeah.
Think about how much paper we send out for the local government elections. How many trees die? It's a crazy amount of paper that goes out. So things, put your hand up or make a vote that we should move to online voting. Okay, we got one, maybe. What do you think? Yay, nay? Good idea?
I feel like
if it can be done well. No, you're right. Yeah, if it can be done well and like in the same level of secrecy and everything. Yeah.
Okay. So we got that's not a bad answer. Anybody else?
This is very uninformed of me. I don't really know much, but when I went to go vote the other week, I was kind of like oddly surprised by how I literally just had to turn up with this piece of paper that was posted to me, and they didn't ask for ID or anything. And it was just one of those things I was like, I wonder if people ever even think to like fake votes or like on someone else's identity. And I just naturally occurred to me, and I know about the amount of paper they use as well, that just naturally occurred to me that I feel like online is like a nice direction, but obviously not everyone has internet, particularly at the NBN at the moment. So yeah, I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. And that's actually a really interesting point about voter fraud. You know how in the American elections, right, with Trump and all the rest, they're talking about voter fraud. There was a couple academics there who studied over 1 billion ballot papers in America. A billion, that's with a B. It was vote. They found that the voter fraud in a billion ballot papers was 0.0000006%. So statistically, that doesn't, it's a non-statistic. So that tells you what the voter fraud in America is. Now, America is, they got crazy elections, right? Because they got so much money. Voter fraud in Australia, it's a non-statistical event. It happens, but let's say in South Australia, you could probably count it on one or two hands for ballots. So that's not enough to turn an election. And we're pretty good here at catching people out. So if somebody votes twice, which you can, you can apply for a postal ballot and still rock up to the polling booth, but we can match it. We can't match it from your ballot paper, but there's other ways to find it through declarations to say, did you vote twice? And then there's the full arm of the law that comes down to. So voter fraud in Australia, it's a non-issue. So whenever people say, the elections are corrupt, this and that, if you've ever worked in one, there's so many eyes there. Did I ever bring a ballot box to you guys to show you how it's got security seals on it, and the security seals have serial numbers, and you can't open them up until there's witnesses in the room, and there's always people around. So it's an incredibly it's a very secure process. But once you realize the amount of paper that comes through there for ballots, let's say even if you had an eraser and you tried to change one or two, you might be able to get away with it, but one or two is not going to change anything. You have to do this to tens of thousands. And so to say it's foolproof is an understatement. So yeah, no such thing as voter. Now, well, there is voter fraud, but it is so minimal. It's a non-issue. Now, going back to online elections, who has a smartphone? I got one. We all probably have a smartphone. Anybody do online banking? Pay whatever bills, send money to your mates or something like that. Yeah, I do the same. So you trust your bank, right? Yeah, but I trust my bank as much as I can. What's interesting is that a bank has, I think it's called a bleed rate, that they are willing to lose maybe, they're willing to sacrifice billions of dollars in fraud because they know that they can make it up in other ways. So the banking system is open to fraudulent interactions. Now, have you ever had a transaction on your account saying that wasn't me, and you try to challenge it? Yeah, yeah. The more you use your card, the more that the potential could happen. When you do a transaction, they can trace it back to an account or something, so it's not secret. Now, one of the reasons why we can't do online voting is that there is no way to make it anonymous. So there's no way to separate those connections to say you voted, so we can check you off, but to make it fully secure in that way, you can still trace it back. So you can't make it secret, and we can't make it secure yet. So it can't be 100% secret, and it's definitely not 100% secure. Whoever's watching pays attention to the Ukraine, they're talking about cyber attacks, this and that. It's also susceptible to being attacked from outside actors. Actors here is just another word for agents. When you have boxes of ballot papers that have to be counted by hand, stored, then if somebody wants to challenge the validity of election, you could take out those ballot papers, recount them according to their preferences, and recreate that exactly. It's almost like if you're a scientist and you have to do an experiment, you have to be able to recreate the same outcome of that experiment. And so these ballot papers get stored. Then after everybody's satisfied, a large portion will get destroyed. However, another portion will be put aside and it'll be studied. It'll be studied for informal. It's like doing a random sample. So they'll take a few random districts and say, okay, we're going to study these. The rest is going to get destroyed because nobody's challenged it. We're positive it's been fair. It's been a fair election. That's fine. We have the winners. All these processes are followed. Now we're going to go back and we're going to examine these, and we're going to look at statistics. We're going to look at patterns. We're going to look at non-voting. We're going to look at preferences. Voting tickets. You guys know what a voting ticket is? How to vote card? when you go to a ballot, when you go to a polling booth, all those party workers out there trying to get you to follow this card. So that's how the preferences flow. Well, we're not going to get into preferences today because I'm not really good at counting votes. You got to be pretty good at it if you want to work in an election, or at least do the preferencing, because it's a special set of skills. I don't got it. But at the same time, these how to vote cards, it's really about, it's called harvesting these preferences and how they flow down to other candidates as they get eliminated. So I give you somewhat of an overview of the election. So now, here's part that you don't see. We got 7,000 people. We had 700 polling booths. To have 700 polling booths means way before the election starts, you got to get somebody out there to figure out, how do we rent 700 locations? Are these accessible? Does anybody know anybody with a disability? Maybe. We got to figure out, how do we make sure that everybody could participate? So we got to try to find polling booths that are accessible to people who have a disability. It could be, you could be in a wheelchair, you could be blind, and we have to try to make this as accessible as possible, which is very, very difficult because not all buildings are built for accessibility, especially in a country like Australia, where a lot of your buildings, some of them can be pretty old. And that's why we try to go for schools, community halls, and the rest. But you have 700 polling booth locations. That means they have to be staffed. Even to the little things you guys don't think about: pens, pencils, erasers. Ooh, for COVID, we had to think about how to get, where is this? Can we see this? Hand sanitizer. How do we get the hand sanitizer there? Now, everybody's I'm fed up with, I'm done with COVID. Like, that's just, oh, it's here. I'm bored of it. When we were trying to get hand sanitizer, here's a little interesting piece of trivia for you. I was part of the team that was looking at this. We're saying, okay, we need hand sanitizer. How much do we need? So we start calculating. We got 7,000 people, 700 polling booths. We need about 7,000 liters. Guess what 7,000 liters of hand sanitizer is in a location? It's a bomb. So suddenly it was like, uh-oh, we can't have something that is this flammable in the same location that all of our equipment is, all of our voting material is, where people are. So they had to come up with something. So even just something like, how do we ensure people's safety with this, turned into this huge exercise. Now I take it for granted. You go to the stores, you use it, but trust me, nothing is as simple as it looks. If you've ever had to plan a party or something like that, this is a pretty big party for the state. And even just trying to keep everybody COVID safe was a lot of work, very valuable work, but still there's a lot of behind the scenes things that happen. And that's something for you guys I'd recommend is, as you're going through uni, when the next election rocks up, throw your hand up and get on board, because it's good experience, it's transferable in the sense that you can utilize for other things. But once you get into election work, there's always work. If you work at the state, you can work at the federal, you can work at the local government. It's just some extra cash. Okay, there's my pitch about elections. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Because you mentioned right at the start that getting a fine is basically the price you pay for not voting, not taking part in the system. Yeah. You don't have to register though, do you?
This is where it's interesting. The law says enrollment is compulsory. Now, there's no fine that I know of for not being enrolled. But what we have is this thing called, it's a direct enrollment system. So basically it's using data matching, that once you have two different points, let's say you got a Medicare card and a driver's license, it's going to link you up and say, aha, you're this person. Then the Australian Electoral Commission, because they're the ones who control the electoral roll for South Australia at least, or it's a joint roll, sends you a letter to say, congratulations, Dylan, you've now enrolled. And you're saying, what the heck? I didn't do that. I don't want to participate. Too late. So this is why it's better if you're 16, 17, 18. If you got to play the game, you might as well know that you're playing it. So yeah, so it's called direct enrollment. So it just sucks you in and says, hey, congratulations. You have to vote. And that annoys people to say, well, that's not fair. But It's the concept of having compulsory voting. Now, here's a controversial one. Who agrees with compulsory voting? Who thinks it should be mandatory? So we got 2, 3, 4. Okay. Now, I myself, and this is the controversial part, I'm going to say, I'm going to play the devil's advocate, say, I disagree with it. Because now I come from Canada originally. Does Canada have a worse government than Australia? Do you hear about Canada being a failed state? So when we look at, so in my opinion, Canada and Australia are fairly similar, that they're countries that have rule of law, they're democratic, they're open, and they're liberal societies. So it's sometimes I think about compulsory voting in the sense that, does it help us choose better leaders? Or do sometimes people just vote because they have to vote? And again, I could be the minority on this one. Because sometimes when I talk to people, say, well, who are you voting for? Well, who I always vote for. Now, you probably also have that in Canada when you have non-compulsory voting. Now, I think preferential voting is much better than the Canadian system, which only uses first past the post. Do you guys know what that is? Kind of. First past the post could be, let's say, okay, we'll use Australia as an example for a federal election. Let's say Clive Palmer wins and becomes the Prime Minister of Australia, but he only wins with 23% of the vote. And the reason why he could win with 23% of the vote is because the vote could be split up with all these different parties. So the Liberal Party has 18%, the Labour Party has 17%, the Greens have 12%, the Nationals have this. And so we're not looking at coalition, we're pretending they're all against each other. So he has won the most votes out of the piece of the pie, but he doesn't have 50, but he still won the most votes. So he is the winner because he has the most. But unlike preferential voting, where you need 50% plus 1 to be the winner, here you don't need to have 50%, you just need to have the most. And the most could actually not be a full representation. And so this is where Australia has a much better voting system than, say, Canada does, even though I'm on the fence right now with compulsory voting, non-compulsory. But preferential voting ensures that the majority of the people either voted for you or through preferences have chosen you, versus, let's pretend Clive becomes our very entertaining prime minister, which I'll give him credit. I think he would do an amazing job of being an entertainer. I'm not sure how good he is at government, but he would keep us watching the television news, I'm sure. And this is one of those things in America that you see a lot of times. Oh, I don't even want to get into the electoral college because that makes my head hurt. It's a democratic system, but at the same time, it's not democratic. And you guys could talk about American politics. I've almost had my fill of that one, but okay, next question, if there's another one.
I do have a follow-up question if I'm not jumping in front of anyone else. So you were saying that you basically get automatically set up to vote. Now,
you get automatically enrolled to vote, yes.
Yeah, enrolled, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
My partner, she works in disability care, and she works specifically with people who are like non-verbal or have some sort of learning disabilities and stuff like that, people who have to basically communicate via other people. How do you get them to vote while still trying to keep it as secretive and anonymous as possible?
This is where it gets pretty difficult. Yeah, this is kind of like, this is controversial even within our own organization. When we use the term people living with disability. Now, disability is such a big word. It's like the ocean. Usually we just think about somebody who's blind or deaf in a wheelchair, but no. It could be cognitive, it could be mental. You could have a mental illness. You could have dyslexia where you're perfectly fine. You just confuse letters sometimes. That could be a disability. Now, we're going to use your example, Dylan, of let's say you have a neurological and you have a mental disability. Okay, so neurologically, your body's not really working as the way it should be, and your mind isn't working either. So in South Australia, the law says that you can be removed from the electoral roll and they use this term called unsound mind, really like 18th century unsound mind. So you cannot comprehend your obligations to vote. What happens is that to get on this, to be removed from the electoral roll, a doctor has to sign you off to say, yes, you cannot vote. A lot of parents, and again, there's no evidence to back this up. I've worked with disability before. A lot of parents don't want to put their kids or their family on this list because they say, well, what happens if they get better? Because there's always that hope of what happens if something changes. So there's a mechanism to get them off the roll. But at the same time, some people don't want to take this as the last resort to say, because that's the end game, to say, no, they're never going to get better, or no, something's not going to happen. Going back to your question is, how do you ensure that it's a secret ballot? This is where there's work that needs to be done. That let's say you go into a polling booth, you want to vote, but you've lost your motor neurological functions, that you can't use your hand. You can ask somebody to vote for you. Now they can't vote for you in the sense that they can't make your decisions for you. You still have to indicate where you want, but they can mark off the ballot paper for you. Now, is it secret? No. It's secret between that group. Just like if you wanted to go into a polling booth, you can ask anybody you want to go into the polling booth with you, but they can't be a party worker or a campaign worker. But you can ask anybody to say, I need assistance, and they'll say, okay, that's fine. It's secret to a point. It works for the majority of the people, but at the same time, there's still a margin of, it's not utopian, right? It's not perfect, but it's better than anything else that we have.
Can I share an example of that?
Yes.
Please. I was assisting with for a party campaign at the Queensland state election, but obviously got to see how the Queensland Electoral Commission did some things. And I remember at the polling booth I was at, there was a woman who couldn't walk very far, and it was a good 10 metres or something. And the electoral staff actually came out and brought an entire ballot box thing out to this woman.
Yep.
And carried it out there, and she was able to complete her ballot outside, sitting in a wheelchair. And it was just remarkable to me, because I was like, nothing can stop her from casting a vote. But yeah.
We have that also here, that let's say you're stuck in your car. The problem is, how do you get the attention of the electoral official? You're stuck in your car. We can bring the ballots out to you. We will do that to ensure that you can vote. And as part of our job here is to make more people aware that there are ways for them to participate in this system. It's even, so sometimes you see these long queues. We train our employees to be aware that disability can be invisible, but if you see somebody that you say, like, wait a minute, that person doesn't look very good, let's bring them to the front of the queue. So we're trying to retrain it's a cultural shift to retrain people to say, like, there's a single parent with 2 toddlers, 2 infants. You need to be aware of that. Let's take them to the front of the queue and get them through, and this is part of that service delivery. Another question.
On that, I know there was this year there was a massive change. I was talking to my housemate about it. That usually there's 3 questions of what's your name, what's your address, have you voted before in this election, and they added in do you need assistance to vote, because they were really on top of making sure everyone could vote and could vote properly. Which was really interesting to me.
That was a pretty big shift there. Now, even that question, have you voted before in this election, ticks off people so much. Like, what do you mean, have I voted? Well, and then people get angry, but that's what the law says. The law says you must ask these 3 questions. Now, who raised the point about rocking up to a polling booth and you don't need to show ID, you just need to have your how to vote card? Okay, and then that goes back to this thing about electoral fraud. There's studies are out there that what do I have in my pocket? Now, myself, I carry with me my identification. Okay, so I got my driver's license and other things. Not everybody has identification, especially when you're looking at the politics of socio-economical issues. Certain groups are more disadvantaged than others. And in America, when they talk about bringing ID laws into place, this really has to do that more minority groups there's a higher statistical chance that they don't have picture ID than they do. So it's a disenfranchising technique. Now, there's no reason why in Australia that we should need to provide this, because there's no evidence to say that there's widespread fraud. There's actually the opposite, to say that the fraud is a statistical non-event. And when it does happen, we're talking single digit, like it's tiny, tiny. So it's part of it that we live in a fairly honest society in that way, which is good. This is what we want to make, which is what we want to keep. Now, who had their hand up?
That was me. This was a separate question.
Yep.
Just in relation to, did
Please.
you finish it?
Yep.
Yep. So could you walk us through the process of if I wanted to vote from a district that I don't vote, say, so I live in Seaton, which is in the state electorate of Leigh.
Yep.
And if I want to try and vote from the seat of Hyson, can you walk us through the process of doing that and
simple.
what ECSA has to do?
You can go to any polling booth you want in the state. Now they have, basically they're going to ask you, are you voting in your district? And if not, they're going to put you in a different queue. And in that queue, they're going to have ballot papers for all the other 47 districts. And that's called the declaration vote. So you're declaring that you're voting outside of your district, and that vote will be counted for your district, but it has to be separated. So then you have to, then this is how we understand who votes. So you got an envelope, and then you have to declare, I declare that I am voting outside of my district, and you put it in the envelope, you seal it up. It has the declaration on there. You put that envelope into the ballot box, and then that gets counted later. So what happens when they count that is they'll take out the envelope, they'll take the declaration tag, they'll remove that, they'll take the envelope, put it to one side, they'll take the declaration, they'll put it to the other side, and now we don't know, we know that you voted, right? So because we got your declaration, your signature, but we don't know what your ballot is. And because we turn them upside down so we can't see, and then you got a big stack, and when the stack hits, let's say 50, that hits 50, we take it, and we wrap it in a bundle, and then that goes to another table. And so we'll take the example of the bundle of 50, the envelopes, that goes to another group of people, and at a certain time, with scrutineers, everybody's watching, they will then remove the ballot from the envelope, put the envelope to one side, put the ballot to the other side, and then they'll take the envelopes and they'll remove them to another table, and then they'll take the ballots, and then they'll do a count to make sure, do we have a bundle of 50? And this is done with scrutineers and people watching. So even this process here takes time. If you've ever had to open up a letter, think about doing this tens of thousands of times. So you remove one piece, you remove another, and it's a very slow process. Australian elections are not fast, as in the campaign period is quite fast. The process about dealing with postal votes, it's methodical, it's processed, and it's slow.
So just in terms of like the ballots that you set aside for this sort of thing, how many ballots would you keep per electorate in every polling booth, just in case?
They've run the numbers, because remember, we've been doing this since 1907, so they got a pretty good idea who votes out of district. And then they also have something called a ballot on demand, so they probably have a printer there that if you run out, they can print one up. But every ballot has to be accounted for. So it's not just like you can just print something up. It has to come through a specific system, and it's got to have the right security tags on it and everything else.
On that, Felix, from having worked as a deck voter at one point, or deck officer at one point, they had, I think, 10 for each electorate, and then they have 30 blank ballots. So you can handwrite the ballots for the electorate if you run out for a certain district, which I think was a thing that went really weird when someone posted it on social media this year, and it went very viral, I think, across the state. But that's, yeah, kind of the thing.
That's social media. That's why I don't post. And so deck vote, declaration vote. You are declaring that you are voting outside of your district. If you ever work in election, you'll learn lots of slang. You'll never get to use it outside of an election, but hey, you do learn a specific language. Anyone else?
You just noticed that, like, obviously the process for counting votes is really long. Do you have like an average on how long it sort of takes whenever you have to count the votes for a state election?
Oh, for a state election, we try to get the House of Assembly votes on that date counted. So sometimes there's more. So sometimes it has to go, people get tired, like 23-hour days, crazy. You don't want to work people to exhaustion. Right now, just counting the early votes and the postal votes can take days and days to go through, because you got to, again, remove them from these envelopes, do this, do that. And it's quite a laborious process. To give an example outside of the state election, for the local government elections, a council like Onkaparinga sometimes will have like 20 candidates running, and you need computers to calculate because it can take days to figure out how to count these things because it gets so complicated. So the more candidates you have, the longer it takes usually. Luckily for state elections, you get 4 to 5 candidates per electoral district on average. And it's not, yes. So the idea is to get it done as quickly as possible, but just even the system is, we have until March 25th before that's the cutoff for postal ballots. So they're coming through and they're slowly being processed. It's not a game about speed, it's a game of accuracy.
Oh, sorry, just another question. Now that you mentioned postal ballots, obviously, particularly this year with COVID and all that, you can't really cater to literally every potential what if situation. But what are sort of the plans in place in case, let's say, something happens with AU Post when trying to deliver these ballots that have been posted probably at the right time, but for whatever reasons, through the carrier kind of portion of it, just don't get delivered by the 25th?
We've never had to go down that route if Australia Post failed. That's a pretty big, major piece of Australian infrastructure. It's almost like saying if the army didn't work or the healthcare system collapsed. It's not a bad question. Logistically speaking, I don't think there's any organization that has that infrastructure, that reach. So like if Australia Post went down for, we would be, that's uncharted waters, definitely uncharted waters, because nobody has that kind of reach. When you just think about, like, you take Australia Post for granted, but that's a really complex organization. Even the point about trying to print 1.2 million ballots, using just the machines to put them into the envelopes and printing them up and making sure everything is spot on is a science in itself. And you have print houses, and then with the LC, we don't do that manually, that gets scanned. So these big scanners that Fuji Xerox has, so these huge industrial machines are scanning these ballots and trying to figure out, okay, using algorithms, say, okay, this is how people have voted, and starts to tabulate. But that's a good question. What happens if Australia Post falls over? That's one of our big concerns, is what happens if Australia Post doesn't get you your postal vote application in time, or doesn't get it back to us in time. So that's a really big concern that we usually have. But so far, it's like anything. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good at what they do.
I have another question. So this one was actually asked of me by a few co-workers of mine. They know I'm a bit more politically minded, but they asked me why we were filling out the ballot papers with pencil rather than pen.
The law in Australia states you can fill your ballot paper out with whatever you want. You could use lipstick if you wanted to. I don't recommend it because it's kind of a pain in the butt for us, as long as we can interpret what it means. You don't even have to use, you could use Chinese numbers if you wanted to. The law doesn't state you have to use a numbering system. It has to be able to be interpreted as your preference, 1, 2, 3, 4. The reason why we use pencils and not pens is just purely from a storage reason. A pencil can be stored for 4 years. So we spend a lot of money on pencils, right? Like a lot of money gets spent on pencils. You don't really think about it, but what we do is we put that in a storehouse, and then the next election we take them out and we use them again. With a pen, if you did that, you'd have to throw them all away because they wouldn't be functional, and that's it. We actually said to people, bring your own pen or pencil for this election. So there's nothing in the legislation that says you have to use it. It's just a convenience factor for us. But yeah, you can use whatever you want to mark the ballot paper. Does that answer it? But please don't use creative, right? Like hieroglyphics or something to mark your ballot paper, because we'd be, oh gosh, how do we count this?
Well, I'm just taking a look at time, and I've noticed that like this hour is like passed us by so quickly. So I just wanted to just announce that just in case anyone needed to leave, or if you, David, had like a tight schedule. I know you're very busy. Unless if you're happy to continue. This has been quite interesting for me. I can't speak for everyone. I'm having the time of my life.
Well,
but just in case you wanted
for
to
you
wrap
guys.
up.
Well, no, it's really about for you guys, right? Because the normal public really knows nothing about what happens in an election. Besides, they see the pretty pictures, they see the talking heads on the television news, and that's about it. You actually have a much deeper knowledge base already than they do. Because either you've participated in youth parliament, so you see that parliament just isn't this, oh, politicians, they're all corrupt. We don't have to like the people. Like, you don't have to like everybody, but I don't think people choose that job, that role, because they're just doing it for themselves. You have to want to give something up, because you got to give up a lot of your own time, your personal freedom, your personal privacy to enter into this public arena. So yeah, but by participating in youth parliament and even get a bit of background knowledge, it's just to show you that there's a lot more complexity around you than you realize, that we take for granted. And I wouldn't want to be the guy trying to plan out the Australia Post delivery routes, because that's a crazy job.
I might call for, depending on the demand, maybe at maximum, maybe 5 more questions. I don't know if anyone else had any other questions that they wanted to put forward. Yeah, we'll do 5 more at maximum. I'll just put one forward now. I mean, you mentioned earlier that like one of ECSA's goals at the moment, or over the past few years, is to try and really extend their outreach and engagement with those, I guess, voting populace that isn't actually voting or doesn't really care. I was wondering if you can give any insight into like what kind of stuff ECSA is doing to try, or has done to try and cater to those people.
We have a disability advisory group. We have a disability advisory group. We have a youth advisory group, which is, you guys are part of that. We have a CALD, which stands for culturally and linguistically diverse, so multicultural advisory group. We don't do very good with Indigenous and First Nations, probably because we need to have more staff to be able to, for them to represent this group. So we have these various advisory groups that help us come up with strategies and plans to go out there, and so we try to co-design, make materials together, make plans and strategies together. But an example of going for this outreach, for the APY lands. Now, this doesn't represent all Aboriginals in South Australia. It actually represents a small minority of Aboriginals in South Australia. But because they're so remote, we spend a lot of time and effort hiring Indigenous electoral officers to try to go out, well, not to try, to go out there and try to engage with them and try to get them to participate. Now, the problem is, I've never been to the APY lands. They are so far away from us that the linkage between that reality and our reality are those are two different worlds. So sometimes you might be talking with your parents and say, you guys just don't understand. We're generations apart. It's the same thing with some of these groups, that our goal, that we have to be aspirational and reach everybody, but not everybody wants to be reached sometimes. Now, within the CALD community, we do things by hiring groups called community ambassadors who go out there, who try and speak to people in their own language, to go out to especially groups that are new to Australian society, to get them to participate. And so there's various strategies and there's various methods that we go out there to use. The problem is that Parliament, the people that you guys potentially one day will become, have to give us more funding to do this. It's like anything. We have a budget and we try to spend it as well as we can, but it only goes so far. And to become a truly inclusive and multicultural society, it has to start to be reflected in Parliament now. The current government has just come in. There's a lot more women who've now been elected. So this is part of that change. but you need to see different faces, different cultures representative. And so it starts really with Parliament. Once that makeup starts to shift, you will see that how we engage with people, that will all start to change, because it'll take on their values also. Because remember, we're the umpire, but they make the rules that we have to follow. Does that answer that question?
I have a question.
Okay.
Another one. That $80 that you fine people for not voting, does the Electoral Commission get that? Who does that go to?
Okay, so $20 of that is the fine. The other $60 of that is, this is where it gets really fun and then people get annoyed. It's classified under the Expiation Act. An Expiation Act is basically, it's a tax, a levy. So you're paying a tax to the state government. Now, you say, oh, that's not fair. Now that tax to the state government goes to this thing called the Victims of Crime Fund. So it actually goes to a good place. No, we don't keep any of that money. That goes straight back to Treasury. But yeah, but the majority of that actually goes into this Victims of Crime Fund, and it goes to people who've been impacted by more serious things than probably I will ever experience in my life. But no, we don't keep any of that. We are a non-profit organization. Anybody else?
Well, yeah, I mean, Dylan really are just like batting like table tennis at the moment, back and forth between us. But is there, I don't know if you can really speak on this, but is just in general, is there any sort of like changes to the current, I guess, voting or election process that ECSA particularly is like interested or like wanting to see, or
we really wanted to try to get telephone voting across. So we wanted people who had disabilities to be able to use telephones to vote. It's not as simple as just calling up and voting, right? There's a process involved, but really to open up the enfranchisement to people not just with disabilities, but maybe people who are ill or who couldn't get to a polling booth. Now, we can only follow the law that Parliament lays down for us. Parliament says, no, we're not doing telephone voting, so we couldn't roll a system out like that. But more, what would be the term here? So we have a lot of plans that we want to do, but we have a rule book, and the rule book is very strict about what we're allowed to do. So we can only do what's within this rule book. And so what we try to do is we try to basically write up a proposal to say, this is what we want to do, and this is why we think it's good, and then they will debate it. And if we can't convince them, then we have to go back and rethink our strategy, say, well, that didn't get over the line. Let's try this pitch again. So that would be an example of something that we would like to get over the line, but we can't.
You mentioned before that ECSA does a lot to try and reach those disenfranchised groups and those people who are of other minority groups and different language groups and stuff like that, to try and increase their voting, to try and get rid of that group of people who aren't voting. What does ECSA do, or what can we do about those people that actually just don't care, or that don't want to vote, or that think that there's no point in doing it? What does ECSA do, and what can we do about that?
I'm going to be now, this is going to sound cynical. I don't think you do anything. Who here has crazy relatives who talk about conspiracy theories on social media? What can you do to change their mind? You can't. It's the problem with social media. It's fantastic to a point, but it also creates echo chambers. People go out to look for things that reinforce their worldview. The only thing you can do is lead by example. You don't need to get into arguments with people trying to convince them. You don't want to be like one of those people in Rundle Mall, like trying to convince you to change your political belief or religious belief. I don't think it works that way. Leading by example is the only way, because a lot of people who are disengaged in that sense are probably having a pretty tough go in life. And this is part of that psychological outlet to that pretty rough go in life. So if there was a fair society, so this is where we look at our society in general, that's where it would have to change. So people say like, well, wait a minute. Let's say if you're a rough sleeper or homeless, you're going to be disengaged. You need housing before you need to vote, right? Before you get interested in that. So you need some basic social structures and infrastructures around you. And that's really what we want to do. Is most likely, my utopian perspective here would be, we need to have a fair and just society, and that would start to change some of these opinions and issues and trends. And as we can see, society, there's a lot of things that aren't fair in it. And so with that, that's one of those things about, we need equality.
Follow-up question. You mentioned the homeless. Is there anything that ECSA does specifically to try and reach people who do not have a fixed address, or perhaps people who are living in like caravan parks and stuff like that?
Oh, caravan parks isn't like, though that's a home. We would go to we spend a lot of time in the shelters, and we go there, and really our goal is to get the workers and the volunteers at the shelters to understand what we're trying to do. And we have this thing called an itinerant voter. So it's a homeless voter. If you get on this roll, so it's like you're enrolled, but you have an itinerant classification to you. Means if you vote, fantastic. If you don't vote, we don't send you a fine. So we try to convince them that if they vote, good. If they don't vote, they don't get a fine. Now, if they're not on this special roll, if they don't vote, they'll get a fine. So this is kind of that mechanism to say, we want you to participate, but update your enrollment details and get yourself registered as this, because we don't share this information with anybody. But what it does do is to say that we know life is pretty rough sometimes. If it's not for you this time, don't worry about it. Nothing's going to happen. But if you don't get over here, we don't know, and we're just going to treat you like everybody else and say, hey, you didn't vote, you owe us money. And so that's one of those mechanisms, going to places like Hutt Street and helping people understand this. And part of this is not just doing the hard sell, right? Like you walk into a store and somebody's trying to sell you something. You got to go in there and you got to meet these people, and they got to understand who you are. You got to build relationships with them, and that takes time.
Well, yeah, I think that makes up about like maybe our last question there. So thank you everyone for coming. Also, thank you so much, David, for like spending your time and entertaining all of our questions. It's actually genuinely been amazing just to hear about how much advocacy work that goes behind the scenes of ECSA, rather than just like aside from all the counting.
Yeah, because you guys see the parts the politicians get elected, but there is a lot of people here who believe in what they're doing, and that's the only reason why you get these kind of outcomes. Because you got to go out there and you got to try to walk in other people's shoes.
I feel like ECSA at this point is honestly carrying us, like the entire state. I had no idea that that your involvement extended this far with that much outreach. So that's just really inspiring and really cool. But yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining us. Yeah, that was pretty much about the end from us. I don't know if Felix wants to have any final comments.
No, I think you said it well.
Well, that's fantastic. I loved it. Hopefully, I will be able to talk with you all as Youth Parliament kicks up again, and we're going to have local government elections. So the big thing is, how do we get higher turnout in local government elections? That's what we're going to have our next chat about, and how do we get more youth candidates to participate in local government elections, and why it's important, because that's where our big weakness is at the moment in South Australia. We got a very low turnout rate.
That's super cool. It's super.
That'll be our next talk. Hopefully, we do that in person.
Yeah, that would be so much better.
I'm over COVID.
Yeah, well, in participant intake is about, I think, almost going to be finalized in the next coming weeks or like month or so. We'll be notifying them soon that they've been formally accepted into the program. So there's definitely lots of opportunities down the road to hopefully have you come visit us again in person with lots more people and a lot more young people to sort of encourage them to come along to these local government elections. So, yeah,
and it's really part of this is co-designing with you guys about what do you want to talk about versus just, it could be as dry as you want, or we got to make it interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it was my pleasure. I hope everybody has a great time and stay safe.
Yes, you too. Good luck counting the rest of those postal votes.
No worries. Cheers. Bye, guys.